Comrades and friends, good evening and welcome to this NEU and PCS webinar and film screening featuring Defence of Children International's documentary, Caging Childhood, Palestinian Children in the Israeli Detention System. I'm delighted that so many of you have signed up to see this. This will be an extremely good event. I'm looking forward to it very much. It's, of course, a very difficult thing to watch because children's childhood is being stolen. Palestinian their childhood is being stolen. But it is a key campaign for the NEU and for the PCS. We know that Israeli forces and armed Israeli civilians have killed 78 Palestinian miners in the occupied West Bank and besieged Gaza, making 2021 the deadliest year on record for Palestinian children since 2014. Adamir reports that Israel arrested 8,000 Palestinians over the past year, including more than 1,300 minors and children, and 184 Palestinian women. At the end of 2021, Israel held over 4,600 Palestinians, including 200 children, 49 women, and 520 administrative detainees in prisons. This is an appalling record, and it clearly needs to be known by lots more people so that we can amplify the voices of Palestinians, but also we can make the case with our own government, but anywhere we can, about what appalling treatment these Palestinians are receiving. I'll just briefly say that I'm sure, comrades, you absolutely know that we expect everyone to be respectful and to make this an inclusive and safe environment. The chat will be open for questions because after the film and our three speakers will be inviting questions from the audience. We obviously won't tolerate any form of harassment, discrimination, disrespectful or unacceptable behaviour or comments in the chat in particular, but of course, obviously, anywhere. So thank you very much for joining. And I'm now going to ask for the film to be played, after which we will hear our speakers, and then it will be your opportunity to ask some questions in the chat. Thank you very much and welcome again.
Each year, approximately 500 to 700 Palestinian children, some as young as 12 years old, are detained and imprisoned in the Israeli military detention system. Children go through harsh experiences during arrest, transfer, interrogation, hearings, life in prison, and even after they are released. In this film, we will hear the stories of 3 ex-detainee children, Islam, Kusai, and Osama.
اسمي أسامة دويكات، عمري 16، سجنوني إسرائيليين 7 أيام.
اسمي إسلام كامل، عمري 17 سنة، اعتقلت مدة 2 شهر في السجون الإسرائيلية.
أنا اسمي قصيب خليفة من مخيم جنين، اعتقلوني 29/1/2019.
بكيت جاي أنا وأصحابي رايحين على بيت فوريك بدنا نقلط على الحاجز العسكري، وفجأة طلعونا 3 جنود علينا وقالوا لنا وقف، رفعوا علينا السلاح وإحنا وقفنا وحطوا ركوبهم علينا، وبعدها قعدونا شوي وعصبونا وكلبشونا في ايدينا، وبعديها أخذونا تحت البرج العسكري وقعدونا تحت المطر من الساعة 2 الظهر للساعة 3 الصبح، واحنا تحت المطر اجانا ضابط اخذنا كل واحد لحالنا وصار يحقق معنا وصار يهدد فينا، صار يقولنا يعني بتروحوش وبهسه بدي اضربكم. فجأة يعني حسينا في مية وطلعنا يعني من تحت العصبة وشفنا الجندي برش علينا مي وهي الدنيا مطر، وطلعنا على الجند الثاني وبكى يصور فينا فيديو.
أنا بعيش بهذا المخيم اسمه مخيم جنين، وأنا بعتقله وبقتله وبضربوا غاز على الناس، والناس بتعرفش تنام بالليل من الصوت والطخ، من لما يصير بينهم وبين الشباب مواجهات. وزي ما اعتقلوني اعتقلوا غيري نص المخيم هون. اعتقلوا اغلب شباب المخيم وانا من ضمنهم. وهاي في فيديو بثبت يوم ما فاتوا اعتقلوني، هم الجيش صوروه. على الساعة 3 الفجر فاتوا الجيش، اجوا فاتوا صاروا طبشوا وضربوا اخوي على اكبر واحد، ضربوه وحبسوا امي لحالها، حبسوها بغرفة وحبسوا اخوي بغرفة وطلعوني من الدار. ضليتني ماشي بالسكعة، بكت الدنيا مطر ايامها، ضليتني ماشي بالمطر لمدة 3 ساعة والدنيا بكت مطر. طلعوني حط لتن وصلنا على باب الجبات، اجوا غاد غمضوا عيناي وظلهم مطلعيني على الجبات.
بكينا نتمشى انا واصحابي بالبلدة، مرة فجأة جب جيش صار يطخوا النار علينا، فدشوا علينا مرة واحدة مسكونا ربط يشدوا الكلفشات يغمغم عشان ما نشوف شو وين بدنا نروح، ونزلونا عن جبات رشاض، كان الجبات بعيد شوي، نزلونا علينا رشاض بدفاش ويزحزحوا فينا وهيك تا وصلنا الجب. فتح الباب مسكوني أزيد من واحد، رفعوني رموني رمي جوا الدورية، حتى ما عرفتش وين أنا وين جيت قاعد، فرشيت ظهري بعرفش حتى وين رشيته، فلو ما شفت له فاتح الباب فيي، لو طلعت راجع على الباب كم رحت معك فلكاني.
بعد 12 ساعة وأنا تحت المطر وتحت البرد وأنا تحت البرج، أجا جب أخذني وأنا بكيت مكلبش ومغمغم، أخذوني على مقر الشرطة الإسرائيلية.
أخذوني بالدورية، قعدت على أرضية الدورية، حتى بكيتش عارف وين أنا رايح. وإحنا حتى بالدورية كانوا يتخوثوا علينا ويتساكعوا وهذا ويضربوا فينا بديهم وهذا، تا وصلنا المستوطنين رمونا على الأرض، وكانوا محاوطين ويتخوثوا ويصيحوا وحاطين أغاني ويرقصوا.
نزلوني من الجب على مستوطن الدوتان، قعدت 3 ساعة بالشتاء. بعد بشوي فوتوني على الغرفة، بكيت مكلفش ومغمغمات عيني.
خلونا برا بالساحة من 6 المغرب للساعة الصبح، واحنا مرميين، وحتى بالليل لا بنعرف ننام ولا بنسكع من كل شوي الجنود يجوا يضربوا فينا قوموا تناموش وهذا. طلبنا حرام على واحنا نايمين ما قبلوش يجيبه.
بعد ما خلصنا من أرائيل جابونا على سجن حوار الهيو. وبكن ايدي مربطات وعصبة على وجهي. دخلوني انا على غرفة 11 وبكن يعني اواعي مبلولات من المطر، وبكت الدنيا علي برد ونمت يعني في اواعي وبكيت بردان يعني، وحسيت الصبح بكيت اني مريض ومرشح.
الاكل اللي غاد اللي بعسكلام مش مليح، اول 3 ايام ما اكلتش غاد، بعدين الواحد بجوع بعرف شو بده يعمل، صرت عادي ادبر حالي.
فتنا على غرفة بكاش ساكنها حدا، كان الوسخ على الأرض، الأكل الأسرة الكبل على الأرض مش مشطوفة ولا إشي، نطلب إننا نشطفها إشي ما يقبلوش. حتى الفرشات فيها الفرشات هالركاك كثير عشان ما نعرفش ننام، شباك مفتوح عشان السكع عشان أي إشي يفوت هس. كنا ننام بالليل ما نعرفش وين الوقت، فيش ضي جوا الغرفة، بعد المغرب يعني تطفي العتمة، ما كناش نعرف وين بده يؤذن الساعة، ما كناش نعرفها.
في ال7 أيام هدول فيش يعني إلا مرة بعد ما فوتوا الكبار طلعونا 10 دقايق فورة وبعدين صيحوا علينا وفوتونا.
قعدنا 11 يوم بعذاب حمام ما تحممناش إلا مرة، بالموت أخرى بعد ما قعدنا أزل مرة ننادي عليهم كان صياح علينا، يعني كان عذاب.
Israelis and Palestinians are subject to two different legal systems: civilian law for Israelis versus military law for Palestinians. For Israeli children, the minimum age for a custodial sentence is 14. For Palestinian children, it's 12. While parents of an Israeli child can attend interrogation, Palestinian parents cannot. For Israeli children, the maximum period of detention before being brought in front of a judge is 12 to 24 hours. For Palestinian children, it's 24 to 72 hours. The maximum period of detention without access to a lawyer for Israeli children is 24 hours. For Palestinian children, it's 90 days. For Israeli children, the maximum period of time between charge and conclusion of legal proceedings is 6 months. For Palestinian children, it's 1 year.
In general, military courts should only be used to try members of the armed forces, because in general, the standards of due process and fair trial are much lower in military than in civilian courts. But children in particular need to have special child justice systems, and they never exist in military courts. So that's why children should never be tried before military courts.
The Israeli military detention system, the Israeli military court system, it is not a justice system. This is a system that denies children access to lawyers, physically ill-treats 3 out of 4 of them, denies them basic due process rights, and then holds them in pretrial custodial detention awaiting court hearings. Children are rarely released on bail, and this is a process of controlling the Palestinian population.
فوتونا زي اليوم فرضية، طبعا بغرفة صغيرة هي، يعني الواحد بيعرفش يتحرك بيها، بس محطوط بيها بكلبها فرشة ومغسلة وحمام. الضوء بيبقى بوجه الواحد، يعني بيعرفش ينام من الضوء. بكينا نحاول نشلح أواعي الشباص ونحطن على وجهنا عشان نعرف ننام. بالزنزانة لما الواحد بكى يقعد ما بكاش يعرف يقعد مليح، بده يركي ظهره على الحيط في زي الكسارة الخشني، الواحد بيعرفش يحط ولا ظهره ولا راسه عليها. عرفش وجو الزنزانة محبط، اللون الزنزانة محبط. بكذا ظني قاعد بس افكر وقت اطلع من الزنزانة.
العزل مخيف للأطفال، بيوجه انتباهاتهم نحو الذات، فممكن انه يبدوا بيشعروا بآلام جسدية، بيشعروا بتعب، بيصير عندهم تفكير بشكل مكثف جدا، ممكن ان ينتهي بهم الامر الى تطوير هلوسات وضلالات اللي هي معتقدات خاطئة، بينفصلوا عن الواقع، بيخافوا انه ما حدا رح يعرف ايش عم بيصير معاهم، وطبعا هذه يعني هي تجربة خبرة مرعبة بشكل كبير. واحنا بنشوف كثير من الناس اللي حتى لما يطلعوا من الأسر ومن العزل الانفرادي ويصيروا فيما بعد سويين من ناحية نفسية، بيوصفوا تجارب في العزل تكاد تكون تجارب مرضية، تجارب زي النوبة الذهانية الحادة اللي يصابوا فيها بفترة العزل بسبب تطوير هذه الهلوسات والضلالات.
Between January 2016 and December 2020, Defense for Children International Palestine documented the ill treatment and torture cases of 610 Palestinian children. These children experienced hand and leg ties, blindfolding, physical violence, strip searches, verbal abuse, and other forms of ill treatment.
It is a general rule of international law that torture is absolutely prohibited. Secondly, every single act of torture needs to be investigated by independent state authorities with the aim of bringing the perpetrators to justice.
خضعت تحقيق لمدة ساعة مع جنديين، واحد بكي لابس مدني يحقق بالعبري، وواحد بكي يترجم لي يعني بحدي بالعربي.
أول إشي بكى يجي محققين عليه، بكى يجي 3 محققين يتناوبوا عليه. أول إشي بكى يجي باليوم أقعد 3 ساعات 3-4 ساعات بالتحقيق.
بعد ما خلص تحقيق أنطاني إفادة بالعبري عشان أوقع عليها، ما قبلش أوقع عشانها بالعبري، فأجوا قال لي طب توقعش عليها بتطلعش من عنا من عطسيون، أجبروني حتى وقعت عليها.
صار شو اسمه المحقق صار يجي يرجع يحكي لي ده بتعترفش هسه نرجع دوركم ونطبشها، وظلوا يهدد.
Israeli security and military forces are applying, and that is well documented by international monitoring bodies, all kind of psychological pressure that can be considered as psychological torture, similar to what the United States have been practiced in the so-called war on terror. The whole idea is to put so much pressure on those children that they finally confess to the crimes that they are suspected of having committed.
Israeli military law provides no right to legal counsel during interrogations, so Palestinian children are essentially alone in an interrogation room with a highly trained, highly skilled adult Israeli interrogator. Sometimes there's a phone consultation with a lawyer prior to interrogation, but what we found is that these consultations are not meaningful, often very short, and also do not create a third-party presence in that interrogation room.
بعد ما نادى اسمان وهات اجى تفتيش كامل الجسم، فتش وهات، ربطنا بايدينا وبجرينا بحديد، وفوتنا على البوسطة بغرفة سوداء يعني عتمة صغيرة حديد، بكيناش يعني نشوفش الهواء الا بمزقان، بكي شغال 24 ساعة، يعني اذا طفى على الفاضي ما نقدرش نتنفس. قعدنا بالبوسطة بيجي 4 ساعات واحنا بالبوسطة، بكيناش نعرف حتى وين احنا رايحين، ما عرفناش الا لما وصلنا من جدة. كل الجسم صار يوجعني بحديد، قاعد انا حديد خلال 4 ساعات، انا قاعد على حديد، المد اجري بقدرش، تعبت كثير بالبوسطة، راس صار يوجع.
أنا كان لي المحامي إنك أنت اليوم مروح، وأنا يعني فرحت، وبعدين طلعوني، وأجي صاحب أخوي أخذنا من حوارة، حاجز حوارة، وأجت أختي وأخوي أخذوني، وأنا يعني فرحت وعبطوني وصرت أعيط، وبعديها روحت على الدار عبطت أمي وعم خالتي وعمتي، كيف جوا وكيف برا يعني العيشة. سجن يعني ذل خراب إن شاء الله. شو
جيت رحت لبست وتحممت حلكت، لو بعد بشوي عزت علي، في بكيت ناس تاركهم وراي ملاح يعني أصحابي، قعدت تقريبا 2 سنين وأنا وياهم نفس الغرفة عايشين، طولنا مع بعض يعني بكينا زي الأخوان وزيادة. بس طلعت هون تعلمت إنه زي فت على حياة تانية. حاليا هسه رجعت على الشغل، بشتغل وبصرف على الدار، ورجعت لحياة طبيعية زي ما بكيت قبل، والحمد لله هسه تيسرت الأمور.
كنت أفكر إني برجع للتوجيه، هم التوجيه إنه هاي فرحة العمر. بعد ما روحت كملت، بس كانوا زملائي بالمدارس قاطعين شوط كبير، في إلي 3 أخوي جربوا الاعتقال، كنت أنا الرابع فيهم، بس الحمد لله كانت فترة أقل.
السجن بشكل عام هي تجربة قاسية جدا على الأطفال وتسيء لنموهم الطبيعي وتسيء لنشأتهم كرجال ونساء في المستقبل، وبالذات إذا كان هذا السجن هو سجن سياسي مش سجن بسبب سوء تصرف أو تصحيح للسلوكيات تبع الأطفال. أنا بعتقد أنه هم بدهم الكثير طيف واسع من الخدمات، من خدمات الدعم النفسي اللي مش بالضرورة طبية. بعض منهم اللي بيعانوا من أعراض حادة مثل الاكتئاب، القلق، أعراض ما بعد الصدمة، الأعراض الذهانية اللي قد تنشأ في العزل الانفرادي أو في غير العزل الانفرادي، أو التمني الموت والأفكار الانتحارية. هدول بدون شك يجب أن يوجهوا إلى خدمات أكثر تخصصاً.
In the case of children deprived of liberty in Israel, we are usually talking about young children between the age of 12 and 17, usually boys, throwing stones at tanks of Israel. This is not a very serious crime. So for these kind of offenses, even if they are violating the military code of Israel, still the principle of measure of last resort applies. They should not be put in police custody. They should not be put in pretrial detention. And in principle, they should also not be convicted of such minor crimes that have to do with the general situation in the occupied Palestinian territory.
Well, even for those of us who know about the situation for children and young people in Israeli detention, that I think is a truly shocking film. And the witness testimony from the three young people is quite extraordinary. And the possibility for immense psychological damage, as well as the torture that they suffer during their periods of detention. We're now going to move into the section of our meeting where we hear from our speakers, and our first speaker is Shayna Lowe, who is the advocacy officer for Defence of the Children International Palestine, who co-leads on the what you saw at the end of their No Way to Treat a Child, that campaign. So, Shayna, I'm very delighted to invite you to speak. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Christine, and thank you all for joining. I want to thank the PSC and the NEU for organizing this event and inviting me to join you. I just want to give first a little bit of background about Defence for Children International Palestine, and who we are and why we made this film. So DCIP, as we call it in shorthand because the name is quite long, is a local Palestinian human rights organization, and it's the only one that focuses exclusively on Palestinian children's rights. We document all sorts of human rights violations against Palestinian children, everything from the fatalities figures that Christine opened the program with, to documenting injuries and other rights violations, like violations of the rights to housing, health, and education. We were actually founded over 30 years ago in 1991 as a legal aid organization to provide lawyers for Palestinian children detained in Israeli military in the Israeli military detention system. And since then, we've been representing and defending Palestinian kids. Through our representation of these children, we realized that we were hearing the same stories over and over again, stories like the ones that you heard in this film. And we realized that the experiences that these children were having in detention were, and the ill treatment and torture and rights violations were not, they weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a system that was widespread and institutionalized, intended to inflict harm on these children. And it was no accident that these rights violations were occurring. And so we realized that we couldn't limit our work to just representing Palestinian children in these courts, and that we needed to really expand our mission. And we started documenting these rights violations so that we could identify patterns and trends, and then using that documentation as a means of advocacy, like the No Way to Treat a Child campaign that we started in the United States and have expanded to run campaigns in countries all around the world, including the UK. And so our focus through that international advocacy is to highlight what is happening to Palestinian children and to put pressure on Israeli authorities to end these practices and to hold, and for the international community to hold the perpetrators accountable. I want to just mention one practice that's not mentioned in the film that we've been tracking over the last few years and really has gotten more attention in the last year or so. And that's the administrative detention of Palestinian children. And administrative detention is the detention of an individual without charge or trial. For those of you in the UK, it might come as no surprise that the authority that Israel, from which Israel derives this practice, actually comes from the defense emergency regulations that were enacted in 1945 under the British Mandate government. And those regulations were then adopted into Israeli law in 1948. And administrative detention orders are issued by the military commander of the region or an official who he's deputized and authorized to have that authority, and then are given basically a rubber stamp approval by Israeli military court judges. And Israel had actually suspended this practice for Palestinian children between 2012 and 2014. But since October 2015, we've documented 41 children who've been held pursuant to administrative detention orders. And there are currently 3 teens who are being held without charge or trial in Israeli prisons. 2 of them have actually turned 18 since they were first detained, and one remains a child and is 17 years old. One of those boys is Mohammed Mansour, who was arrested from his home in Jenin last year and has been detained for 319 days without charge or trial. A third administrative detention order was issued against Mohammed last Monday on February 13th and is set to expire on June 6th of this year. He'll be held for 14 months without charge or trial. And it's been indicated by the courts that this will be the last administrative detention order issued against Mohammed. The second teen I want to mention is a young man now named Amal Nakhla, who was detained almost 400 days ago. He was detained in January of last year. He's had 4 administrative detention orders issued against him, and Amal suffers from a chronic autoimmune disorder that requires constant medical treatment and monitoring, and really, particularly given the fact that we're in a global pandemic, is more at risk than ordinary children would be. Amal can actually not get vaccinated against the coronavirus and takes immunosuppressants as a result of his condition. And he actually tested positive late last month for COVID-19 and had to be transferred to a military hospital for treatment before being sent back to Ophir prison. UNICEF, UNRWA, and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights have issued a joint statement last month calling for Amal's immediate release. And in November of last year, the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention issued an opinion that said that Amal's detention was in fact arbitrary, and also reaffirmed the fact that the Israeli military courts, through which obviously his administrative detention is being approved, fail to meet international standards for independence and impartiality. There's a third teenager, 17-year-old Wadia, who has been detained since September, and his second administrative detention order is set to expire next Monday on February 28th. So I just wanted to flag those cases because they are a bit unusual, but they are nonetheless extremely serious. Obviously, not being charged or tried and being detained indefinitely is a serious violation of a child's or an individual's due process rights. And we recently published a news alert on the Defense for Children International Palestine website, documenting those cases and talking a little bit more about the procedures behind them and the rights violations inherent in administrative detention. The last thing that I want to mention is, of course, the No Way to Treat a Child campaign. And as you saw at the end of the film, this is a campaign that seeks to challenge and end Israel's prolonged military occupation and control of Palestinians by organizing individuals, grassroots organizations to demand accountability and protections for Palestinian children, including an end to Israeli military detention. And so we have been running this campaign for about 6 or 7 years at this point, and have used the stories of Palestinian children, the evidence that DCIP collects, to educate grassroots audiences and policymakers and push for accountability and an end to child detention and an end to occupation and control of Palestinian lives. So we work in partnership with organizations like the PSC and like the NEU and other UK partners to work on this advocacy. And in the coming months, we'll be working more closely together in order to promote additional campaign work that can be done in the UK. We also host monthly webinars that provide regular updates from the ground, offer insight into some of the documentation that DCIP is gathering and collecting, and work on really helping grassroots activists to develop advocacy skills to be able to advocate more effectively on this issue. So I'd love to invite folks who are interested to join us. Our next webinar is actually going to be on March 15th at 5 p.m. London time. So with that, I thank you all for joining us and hearing the stories of these children, and I'll pass it back to you, Christine.
Shana, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. It's really critical and important work that DCI Palestine does, and we were delighted that you were able to join us this evening. And I know from my long association with the NEU and its predecessor union, the NUT, how important the relationship between DCI Palestine, the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, and the union, the NEU, is. So I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker, who is currently the president of the NEU and who is indeed a true internationalist. Daniel, the floor is yours. Daniel Kebede.
Thank you very much, Christine. And it's a real honor actually to be on this panel with Shana, yourself, Christine, and Louise. And we're really proud to be a part of this meeting. And as you rightly said, we are longtime supporters of Palestine Solidarity Campaign, DCI Palestine, and supporters of the No Way to Treat a child campaign. And in fact, I'm immensely proud of the work that my union has taken part in. Every year we send 2 delegations to Palestine. They go in February half term and October half term. Educators, teachers, teaching assistants, school leaders from around the country go on these delegations in their own time, and they go and visit Palestine, meet people, and really immerse themselves in sort of the experience of Palestinians. I have in fact been on one of those delegations, and it's very much a trip that will stay with me for the rest of my life. From the moment you land in Tel Aviv airport, you get a small insight into what life is like in the Palestinians occupied territories. In our delegation, who went to Palestine, it was the person of Palestinian heritage who was held up by airport security for some very many hours. But we spent 5 days there, and you're met with such kindness, such hospitality by the people who live under the most brutal oppression. Not only is life very difficult for Palestinian teachers, they were without salary for about 8 months when we arrived. They can be stopped at checkpoints without explanation and unable to make it to school. But life for the Palestinian children is marked by incredible cruelty. We saw it in that very moving video. We attended a school in Hebron, and as we got closer to school, the walk became utterly intimidating for our delegation. Soldiers were lining the narrow pathway, and these soldiers, by the way, looked little more than children themselves, but they were lining the pathways with machine guns. Moments earlier, they had just gone into the school and demanded that it be closed so they could show settlers around the town. Now, the teachers resisted, but the IDF still got someone on the roof. I mean, how frightening. It was frightening for our delegation, but of course the children of Palestine live through this all the time, and they are, utterly innocent. And that's not only how children suffer. We took our members and delegates to DCI Palestine, and we heard firsthand how children are often stopped at checkpoints, denied access to their education. But what we are utterly horrified by is the fact that every year children as young as 10 are imprisoned. 60% of them arrested in the home, often as they sleep at night. They're taken from their parents. We were hearing reports of the blindfolding and having their hands tied in transfer from arrest to the interrogation center. Ordered to sit on the metal floor of a vehicle. They were subjected to physical and verbal assaults. And we were hearing reports of children being put in solitary confinement for up to 2 weeks. And in my opinion, my personal opinion, this is something that can only be described as torture. And of course, when they stand trial, this is often in the military court. There's no right to representation. The trials take place in Hebrew and not Arabic. And the most common crime, obviously, that they're there on trial for is stone throwing. The experience of Palestinian children is far different to the experience of children here in the UK, and of course to vastly experience a different experience to the experience of Israeli children also. But we have to be absolutely clear about the Palestinian struggle. It's a struggle for rights and for freedom, but it's really an anti-racist struggle also. We've got a great tradition of organizing in that regard. So it's absolutely imperative that we all stand together in regards to this. And of course, I just want to mention Desmond Tutu because he's sadly passed earlier this year, but he said, if those who turn a blind eye to injustice actually perpetuate injustice, if you're neutral in situations of injustice, you've chosen the side of the oppressor. I think it's really clear. I think it's really important that we're really clear that we want justice for all people, whether they're Jewish, whether they're Muslim, but we have to really advocate for the children. Every child has a right to live in a society where they have access to education, to health, to all the things necessary to make them flourish. So I'm really proud to be here, but please, please support the campaign and be an advocate for the children of Palestine. Thank you very much, Christine.
Daniel, thank you very much for that contribution. Everyone can tell, I think, how heartfelt it was, and I must say, my own experience from having been on both NUT delegations and other delegations is much similar to yours. I think everyone should go and visit Hebron and just begin to imagine what life must be like living there day in, day out. And so we come to our final speaker before we move to our Q&A. Our final speaker is Louise Regan, who is the Vice Chair of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. And she is also a National Officer of the National Education Union. She, like Daniel, is absolutely an internationalist, and she is a staunch supporter and promoter of the Palestinian cause. Louise, the floor is yours.
Oh, thanks, Christine, and thank you for those kind words. It's very hard to follow on, actually, after the last two speakers, and I was very privileged to be on the same delegation as Daniel to Palestine and experienced that very harrowing trip in Hebron, and it was very disturbing to see the impact on those children. My journey really in this, actually, I have to say, started with DCI Palestine. Although the NUT, the predecessor unions, the NEU, had got long-standing policy on Palestine, and I'd always been very supportive, I hadn't actually become really active. But 10 years ago, Gerard Horton from DCI Palestine spoke at the NUT conference, and for people there will be people watching who are union members who've been to conference and know how fussy it is. Nobody listens really. There's lots of chitter chatter, and Gerard got up and started speaking, and there was silence. You could have heard a pin drop. There were 1,000 people in our conference. There was absolute silence, and people were clearly harrowed by what he said. I was devastated when I listened to the stories that he told in those moments. And he went on to do a fringe meeting. The fringe meeting was full. There were people stood in the corridors trying to listen again to what he was telling them. And I think as educators, hearing the stories around what has happened to children is quite shocking. But actually, also, as a parent, I just thought, how would I feel if that was my child that was being dragged out of my house? And I knew that there would be no opportunity for me to do anything to stop that, and also to do anything to support them in the coming months. Because that is the fact for Palestinian parents. They know that if those soldiers break down that door, take their children away, there is nothing they can do to stop it, but the chances are that there is nothing that they will be able to do to intervene and support those children whilst they're in that detention. And for me, as a parent, I just found it devastating. I just found it heartbreaking that we as a country and as a people remain silent about children being treated in that way. So in some ways, I'm here as Vice Chair of PSC because of that speech, because that is what made me say enough is enough. I have to get out and I have to do something. I have to advocate. I have to be a voice for people who don't have a voice at the moment. I mean, I think the films that DCI produce are so powerful. I use them a lot locally, and I know PSC use them a lot locally. I mean, I'll talk about, I am a national officer of the National Education Union. I'm very proud that our union has such a strong commitment to this cause. I wouldn't be in any other union. I'm vice chair of Palestine Solidarity Campaign, which is absolutely also committed to this cause, and I'm very proud to hold that role. I speak about it a lot. I will speak out continually. I will not be silenced about what is happening to the Palestinian people. This is a core campaign for the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign, and I think that's really important. Our website has a huge amount of resources. We have a petition that people can sign. There's a fantastic activist toolkit that people can go on, can access, can use in their own areas, can use to lobby their local MP or people within their council. But there's also other things that people can use for union members in their local districts, have a meeting, talk to people about it. For me, I've always found that this campaign is the one that people think, oh, enough is enough, really. There are some things which are difficult to talk to people about around Palestine, but when you start talking about children being arrested in the middle of the night, children being blindfolded, shackled, removed from their parents and no access to their parents, I think that is an issue that people really think this is unacceptable. And I think the No Way to Treat a Child campaign gets really heavily behind that. I just want to pick up on a few statistics, and I'm not really a statistics person, but I think it is really important for people in the meeting to realise that we are talking about something which at times can be abstract. But what I would say is that for all of the people that have spoken to you tonight and Christina's chair, we've all been there and seen what is happening. So we're not speaking in abstract, we're speaking in reality and things that we have seen, we have heard, and we have truly feel confident to speak about when we come back. But DCIP did some affidavit work, and there are some statistics around that, and I think they're really important. So they collected 161 affidavits, and of those, 150 of the children had been treated to these forms of treatment: hand ties and leg ties. Now, I don't know if people know what that means, but those are those plastic ties that we use to fasten things to fences and walls. They hurt. If you don't know what it would feel like, please go away and try it on yourself and see how it feels. And those children are in those for hours. It's not a short experience. Physical violence, 120. Blindfolded, 124. I once did a course where I had to be blindfolded to see what it felt like. It's absolutely terrifying. I can't imagine what that would be like for a child. 98 of them shown or signed papers in Hebrew in a language that they don't speak. 138 of them not informed of the reason for their arrest, and 156 of them no lawyer or family member present during interrogation. I think those facts just tell us the situation on the ground, and that it is absolutely right that we are here tonight and speaking out. And the final thing that I want to say is this: when Daniel spoke about the situation in Hebron that we experienced, one of the members that was with us cried. And quite often when we go and visit Palestine, our members will cry. And I understand that with what we see. On one delegation, a member was crying, and the Palestinian that was there said to the member, "We thank you for your tears, but we don't need your tears, we need your voices. So we're asking you to go back and to tell people what you have seen and to be our voice." So what I would say to all of you tonight, as I finish, is that be the voice of the Palestinians, please. Thank you, and I hand back to you, Christine.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Louise, for that. I think that will definitely stay with me. We don't want your tears, we want your voices. And I mean, it is absolutely the mission of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign to amplify those Palestinian voices so that they can be heard in places where they wouldn't otherwise be heard. And I have to say, we have occasionally, I think, taken members from the NEU who were perhaps equivocal about the situation for Palestinians, and who went with, not a closed mind, not an open mind, but just not really understanding just what the situation is. And I am I am as certain as I can be that every one of them comes back absolutely convinced that justice for Palestinian children is something that the NEU has to continue to fight for, and work with the Palestine Solidarity Campaign and work with DCI Palestine. So thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed for that, Louise. We now have the opportunity of some questions from those who are participating, and the first question I think is an interesting one, and I'm going to perhaps ask all of you what notions you have about the response you could give to this. It's a question that says, has any Israeli ever been held accountable for any of this treatment of these Palestinian children? I'm just going, while you're just mulling that over, I'm just going to intervene to say that, of course, it's entirely likely that if we were talking to people who accept the military court system, that they would say what we're doing is perfectly within our rights and within our court system. So, you know, over to you. Well, let's come to Shona first to see what you've got to say about that. Whether you, Shona, whether you think anyone has ever been held accountable for anything which is clearly, as we heard earlier in the film, pretty much only describable as torture. Shona.
Thanks, Christine, and thanks for that question. I don't think that any individual Israeli has been held accountable for the detention of Palestinian children. And I think in some ways the question is, well, why should they be? Because it's not that they're acting outside of the parameters of the system. The system is working exactly the way it should be. And so to date, the international bodies like the International Criminal Court or commissions of inquiry at the UN have not been able to hold individuals accountable. We struggle even to get individuals held accountable for killing Palestinian children or adults for that matter. And so the issue of child detention, no one has been held, no individual has been held accountable. What we're doing through the No Way to Treat a Child campaign is trying to hold them accountable, not as individuals, but hold the system accountable. So for example, in the United States, where I'm based, we have found allies in the US Congress who have introduced legislation that seeks to either withhold US funding or restrict US funding from being used in the detention of Palestinian children. In the UK, we've had members of parliament introduce early day motions condemning the practice. And so trying to shine that part of the way we're going to get accountability is by continuing to shine the light on what is going on and continue to build individuals and policymakers who stand up and say that this practice is unacceptable and cannot continue for a minute longer. And so that's, I think, what part of today is about. It's about building that power, building that strength in order to hold people accountable and in order to end military detention of Palestinian children.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Shana. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Daniel?
Well, I think Shana explained that perfectly. Of course, accountability is really about change, isn't it? That's why we hold individuals accountable. We want them to stop doing what they're doing. We want them to change behavior. I don't know the answer to the question, to be honest. Has any individual person been held accountable? What we really need to do, as Shana so eloquently put, is hold the system that allows this brutality to continue accountable. And the only real way that we can force change is through international solidarity, by being the voices, it's standing together outside Palestine, across the globe, and saying, we don't accept this, this needs to change. It's how, we only brought an end to South African apartheid, for example. Obviously, there was the unity across the working class in Black South Africa, but great amount of pressure was put on through the international solidarity movement, and we need to apply those same principles.
Thanks. Louise, if you've got any additional remarks, we're very pleased to hear them.
Well, I mean, I think people have covered it really. I think the key issue here is that there is a system in place that allows people to do things that are unacceptable. And it's the system that has to be defeated because, as Shana says, you know, people that are doing this are acting within the laws that they are allowed to act within. So we have to expose that and ensure that we call for an end to those, because they are, you know, ultimately they are crimes against children that should not be perpetuated. If you look at the rights of a child, the Charter for the Rights of a Child, that these things should not be happening. So therefore, you know, we have to challenge that. And as Daniel says, the only way for us to do that is collectively and by putting pressure on the government there.
Louise, thank you. I'm just going to put this one question to Shana, which is if these things are considered to be unlawful in terms of international law, the question is from one of our attendees: are there any grounds for going to the International Criminal Court with these issues? Shana, I don't know if you have a view about that.
Yeah, I mean, there is an open investigation at the International Criminal Court. The investigation is looking largely at issues around settlements and appropriation of land, but also around fatalities. We at DCI Palestine actually represent a number of families of children who have been killed by Israeli forces, particularly those who were killed in Gaza during Israeli military offenses in 2014, and also this most recent military offensive that occurred last year. So there are efforts being made to hold Israeli perpetrators to account at the ICC and take advantage of the International Criminal Court. Unfortunately, the process is very slow moving. Up until early last year, there was a question around jurisdiction that finally got sorted out. And that was when, shortly before the prosecutor at the ICC finished her term, she made the announcement that the preliminary examination phase was ending and that they were opening an official investigation. So DCI Palestine, other human rights organizations have been submitting evidence, but I think it's going to be a long time before, if charges are filed against any Israeli. I think we have a lot of evidence, particularly when it comes to fatalities and also with appropriation of Palestinian land, that there are cases that should be able to move forward, but it will take a very long time.
Shana, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to move us on to some questions that I'm going to roll together now, which will be a question. I'm going to start with Louise, perhaps this time. It's two that I'm putting together. One is that from someone who says people often feel powerless. They see this, it's appalling, but they feel powerless in the face of that. So one of the questions is, what is the biggest act of solidarity that people can do, as it were, from here, or obviously in the case of Shana, from the US? And another question, which is, what can people do to support DCI and PCS? They also say the NEU, but I'm sure the NEU doesn't need that, you know, the same kind of support that DCI and PCS and the Palestine Solidarity Campaign does. But Daniel, biggest act of solidarity and what can be done in support? Over to you.
I think that the biggest act of solidarity is to be vocal on Palestine, but there are a number of organisations to get involved in, such as PSC, DCI, and I think that's the real act of solidarity. You know, build a local group in solidarity with the Palestinian people, build it in your communities. You know, I live in the Northeast, and I can guarantee every Saturday there will be a stall supporting the rights of Palestinian people in the middle of the market square. Go and talk to people about Palestine and the plight that the Palestinian people and particularly children face. I mean, that'll be it.
Thanks. And Louise, I know that you do a tremendous amount of work both in Nottingham, but also obviously nationally and internationally. So let's hear from you about what you think are the acts of solidarity and what can be done to support both DCI and Palestine Solidarity Campaign.
I mean, for me, I think join Palestine Solidarity Campaign, become a member, become active in your local branch. If you haven't got local branches, Daniel says, set one up. And get out on the streets and do things. I think also don't ever feel that you need to be silenced. Speak out, speak truth. You know, we have an absolute duty. You know, I think, you know, Daniel gave a quote, you know, that if we remain silent, we're complicit. And, you know, for me, that's always been my motto, really. I'm not going to be silent when I see people being oppressed. So don't allow yourself to be silenced, always speak out. But also, I think people, you know, sometimes people think we have to do big things. Small things eventually become big things. If lots of people do a little thing, it will make a big difference. So little acts joined together can make a big difference. So continue to share things. Palestinians always see what we do here. They're always very moved when we're taking action on the streets, when we're posting something in support of them. So small actions can make a big difference. Don't be silent, speak out, and remain committed to the support of the Palestinians.
Thanks. We're just saying goodbye to Daniel because he's got to go now. But thank you very much for having been with us, Daniel. And I mean, I think it's really important that there is always something that you can do, and perhaps Shane, you'd like to say specifically about what you think that people on this call can do to support DCI Palestine.
Yeah, thank you, Christine, and thank you, Louise, and to Daniel, who's now left us. But to Daniel for your comments on solidarity, I think as we've said over and over in this call, lifting up the voices and amplifying the voices of Palestinians and their demands is number one, the most important thing that folks can be doing. As many of you probably know on this call, there's been a shrinking space for Palestinian civil society organizations to be operating in. And over the years, we've witnessed an escalation of those tactics, and that culminated in last July, DCI Palestine's office being raided by Israeli forces and equipment and materials confiscated. And then in October and early November, the Israeli Minister of Defense designated DCI Palestine and 5 other leading human rights and civil society organizations as terror organizations. And just a couple weeks after that, the Israeli military commander of the West Bank effectively outlawed Defense for Children International Palestine and 4 of those other civil society organizations. And so continuing to amplify the work of these local organizations and stand up and push back and demand that your government pushes back against these designations, which are blatant attempts to try and silence and delegitimize and criminalize the important work that we at DCI Palestine and other Palestinian human rights organizations are exposing. And so I think remembering that we need your solidarity and support, and by promoting our work, you're helping to push back against the efforts to silence us. I do want to mention, just because this came in over the course of this event that I did receive confirmation from my colleagues in the West Bank that this evening a Palestinian child was actually killed by Israeli forces in El Khader in near Bethlehem in the West Bank. And so we don't have a lot of information yet, but the child's name was Mohammed Rezek Shahada Saleh, and he was 13 years old. So in the next few hours, we at DCI Palestine will be working to get in touch with folks who are who witnessed the event and know what happened, and we will be reporting out. So please stay tuned and follow us on social media and check out our website, where we will certainly be publishing a news alert about this most recent killing. So I want to thank you, Christine, for emceeing this wonderful event, and thank you all for attending.
Thank you very much indeed, Shana. We're close to the end of this event, but I just want to say that someone put in the chat, how can the international community continue to ignore this? And I think the answer is they can continue to ignore it unless more and more and more of us raise our voices to amplify the voices of Palestinians. There are 106 people on this call. If they go away and make sure that they raise their voices and they each ask one other person to raise their voice, to get involved with the Palestine Solidarity Campaign and with DCI Palestine, then we will have taken some small step towards bringing justice to what is, frankly, the most appalling situation for children in the occupied Palestinian territories and in Gaza. So on behalf of all of you who've been present at this event this evening, I want to thank our speakers, Daniel, Louise, and Shana, and I want to encourage you all to stay involved with the Palestinian question. They absolutely deserve peace and justice and freedom. And since we've had Desmond Tutu quoted, we can close, I think, with a Mandela quote, which is, "No one is free until we are all free." The Palestinians absolutely need to be free, must be free, and that is our role and responsibility as internationalists. Thank you all for being here this evening. Good night.